bridging orality and literacy, facilitating inner speech via the tutor as counselor. In Genesis 1, whenever God performs an act of creation, Moses writes, "And God said." Creation, then, is an act of speech. However, this creational speech is found in written form, the Word of God. Within the first pages of Scripture, Yahweh himself establishes a relationship between spoken and written language. Throughout the progression of human history and language, this relationship between spoken language, orality, and written language, literacy, has been interrelated and simultaneously held in tension. Modern studies have suggested that orality is more natural to humans, whereas literacy is associated with academia and rigid expectations, causing a strict divide between the two in the mind of the modern student. Educators who occupy places of authority within academia are left to reconcile this divide, even as students associate them with formal and unpleasant literacy. The question then arises as to how this divide between social orality and academic literacy may be bridged, especially within the university. In order to effectively bridge the relationship between the naturalness of orality and the necessary formality of academic literacy, the writing tutor must transition from the role of teacher to that of counselor, one who masterfully uses both oral and literate language to facilitate inner speech in the writer's mind. But before a divide between orality and literacy may be established within the academic, especially undergraduate sphere, one must first define orality and literacy independently. In Orality and Literacy, the Technologizing of the World, Walter Ong compares oral and written language, establishing key functions and distinctions between the two. In one sense, orality serves as the foundation of language, and for all written word eventually relies on spoken word. In another sense, orality is more communal than literacy. Regarding the communal nature of orality, Ong writes, "Because in its physical constitution is sound, the spoken word proceeds from the human interior and manifests human beings to one another as conscious interiors, as persons. The spoken word forms human beings into close-knit groups." Ong establishes sound as the only sense which can invade interior consciousness without violating it. When one speaks, sound comes from inside the body and travels externally to the next hearer, who will then internalize that sound via the ears. Sound also encircles the hearer rather than being one-directional, such as with sight. Hence, sound puts both the speaker and the hearer at the center of the equation. When words are spoken and heard, according to Ong, both parties are united by the perception and internalization of sound. This is why a national language can be so unifying, and why nations with many languages struggle to be unified. Language becomes part of one's communal identity. Furthermore, Ong writes that orality is completely natural to human beings. Babies engage in oral communication from the moment of birth, though that oral communication does not take the form of speech. In reality, orality is as natural to humans as breathing. In comparison, literacy exists as a form of technology. It necessarily results from the transformation and internalization of orality, which also makes literacy more isolational. For Ong, however, literacy as a form of technology does not degrade its value, for he says, to say writing is artificial is not to condemn it, but to praise it. Technologies are not mere exterior aids, but also interior transformations of consciousness, and never more than when they affect the word. Such transformations can be uplifting. Writing heightens consciousness. As compared to orality, literacy is more artificial in nature and thus less natural to humans. However, writing enhances consciousness, allowing for increased depth of thought and analysis. In the Story of Human Language, Professor John McWhorter agrees with Ong's assessment of literacy and writes, "Writing, as much as we are used to it, is a very deliberate activity, where your brain is turned on in a deliberate way. This kind of language that is designed to be engaged on the page, where it is in front of us, and where we can reread, where we are doing something more slow than actual listening and speaking to us. Words can be spoken with little or no thought, however written words force the human consciousness to be engaged on some level. It requires words to be considered, processed, and engaged with, whereas spoken words may go in one ear and out the other, according to the commonly spoken idiom." Overall, then, the complexity of the relationship between orality and literacy cannot be overstated. Ong summarizes this relationship and writes, "The interaction between the orality that all human beings are born into and the technology of writing, which no one is born into, touches the depths of the psyche. Ontogenetically and phylogenetically, it is the oral word that first illuminates consciousness within articulate language, that first divides subject and predicate, then relates them to one another, and that ties human beings to one another in society. Writing introduces division and alienation, but a higher unity as well. It intensifies the sense of self and fosters more conscious interaction between persons. Orality is natural to humans in a way that writing, as a form of technology, never can be. However, writing fosters a greater sense of consciousness and thought than the immediacy of orality can. Orality unites individual persons in the moment that it is spoken and heard, but literacy unites individual persons across time and space, both as writers and readers. Literacy could not have formed without orality. However, humans could not have achieved the depth of thought and communication that we now engage in without literacy. Both forms of language largely rely on one another, even as they are distinguished by their limitations and function. While Ong and McWhorter established foundations for understanding orality and literacy, other scholars point to complex interactions between these forms of language in contemporary situations. For example, in A Dialogue of One, Orality and Literacy in the Writing Center, Daniel Lockman establishes a major divide between social orality and academic literacy within the mind of the average student. While discussing the function of the Writing Center, Lockman says, students often enter writing centers with false assumptions about the language of the university. Sometimes they misjudge their audience by imagining that academic readers must prefer pomposity, jargon, or the stilted language of textbooks. Students often draw a rigid line separating activities they deem appropriate to the schools from those appropriate to their lives. Because orality is so natural to human communication, students more comfortable in oral culture often find academic literacy either uncomfortable or even impossible. The language used within academia differs from how one interacts with family and friends in everyday life. Hence, many students separate spoken and written language entirely, failing to recognize deeper thought patterns that accompany both orality and literacy as interrelated concepts. Having established this basis, Lockman further argues for the necessity of the formation of an inner speech, which aids in the transition from oral to literate culture. As he says, inner speech, presupposes an informed questioning of the self, a stopping of the flow of experience with a backward glance at causes, motives, reasons for doing something in the past, present, or future. Though nearly all practice some form of inner speech, not all are conscious of doing so or aware of the intellectual systems that govern it. In literate societies or societies influenced by literacy, inner speech often becomes systematic as a species of reflective discourse. In other words, the formation of inner speech fosters an awareness of the deliberacy inherent to literacy. Because orality contains an immediacy, it does not always encourage the student to engage with words reflectively, contemplating meaning beyond the present phrase. Inner speech contributes to a higher sense of consciousness that governs literacy and the academic sphere. Alongside positing the necessity of the formation of inner speech, Lockman further argues that the Writing Center tutor serves as a prime facilitator of this formation, for the tutor serves as a counselor as opposed to a strict educator. According to Lockman, teachers serve as an audience and a critic to the student. However, he later says that counselors bring to the dialogue an informed voice capable of posing questions, directing attention to the text, encouraging evaluation, and sharing the frustrations, fears, pleasures, bad ideas, and good ideas that go into the creation of effective writing. Counselors may still constitute an audience and a critic, like a teacher, but their function extends past criticism to the realm of deep thought and processing. Earlier, Lockman refers to the counselor as a form of alter ego. In this sense, the Writing Center tutor serves as a voice which evaluates a student's writing as if it were his or her own voice. By posing questions and evaluating the quality of ideas, tutors also pose as an example for writers to develop these reflective qualities themselves. In other words, tutors model a version of inner speech that writers can then internalize and use for themselves. Lockman further argues that the counseling tutor fosters inner speech. As he says, the student is made to see the permanence of writing. Unlike oral speech in popular culture, modes of writing in the university often demand scrutiny and reobservation, since the unchanging written statement implies commitment that the oral statement, falling into the void of time, does not. The talking about writing that occurs at the Writing Center provides an oral context that helps highly oral students generate a clearer sense of the fixed, precise character of academic writing. Because the Writing Center utilizes conversation as a method of evaluating written work, the tutor as counselor actually serves as a bridge between orality and literacy. Eventually, inner speech serves as the same bridge within the individual, but the counselor explicitly uses oral processing to aid in the formation of internal processing associated with academic literacy. This is a lot of theory and a lot of research, and it doesn't really mean anything without application. So, in Begin Here, The Forgotten Conditions of Teaching and Learning, Jacques Barzoon provides a practical example of a teacher who functions as a counselor, modeling inner speech as he or she teaches students how to write an essay. Barzoon posits that the teacher should, quote, start out by getting the whole class to suggest ideas bearing on the topic, no matter how far-fetched, for that is how the writer's mind works. Next, show how they are sorted out, rejected, grouped, and subordinated according to some scheme. Finally, the teacher asks for the best idea with which to start the essay, and the best one to end it. One should notice how Barzoon asks teachers to begin with oral ideas. Much like how the tutor as counselor uses orality to discuss literate ideas, Barzoon's teacher ought to use the naturalness of orality to aid students in forming literate ideas. Furthermore, if the teacher asks for the best idea with which to start and end the essay, he or she also encourages students to engage in inner speech. The students have spoken orally, and now they must think reflectively upon each idea and make an evaluative decision as to the best way to engage in literacy. Though Barzoon does not identify this method as contributing to inner speech, he does provide an example of how to bridge orality and literacy in the classroom from a young age. However, students are not always encouraged in the development of inner speech from a young age, as mentioned by Lockman. Therefore, Barzoon's example does not apply practically to the average college student who is forced to evaluate his or her own work in an entirely foreign way. Not every professor may serve as a counselor for every student. Hence, Lockman places the counselor in the writing center. However, the tutor may still find himself acting more as a teacher than a counselor, even against his best intentions. Hence, he or she must learn to recognize the necessity of fulfilling the role of tutor as counselor in practical and challenging scenarios. Steve Sherwood demonstrates how suggesting self-censorship may cause the tutor to enter the role of teacher over that of counselor, potentially inhibiting the development of inner speech. Sherwood defines the dilemma of advising self-censorship as the following when he says, "For the most part, we censor or urge self-censorship in the interest of helping students adjust to and succeed in the academic world. We want to protect students from the practical and political effects of their words. We want to show them that their opinions have consequences, that using sexist or racist terms, espousing particular political causes, speaking carelessly on topics they don't fully understand, and offending their audiences can cost them good grades and the esteem of their teachers and fellow students. However, by encouraging self-censorship in the early stages of composition, we may prevent student writers from fully developing and expressing valid and valuable ideas and opinions. On the one hand, self-censorship protects students from potentially harmful ideas. However, self-censorship also tends to bypass the legitimate evaluation of ideas, according to Sherwood. For the tutor to suggest that a student not discuss a given topic or idea, he or she serves more as a critic than a counselor who asks questions and forces the writer to evaluate his or her own ideas reflectively. For Sherwood, the key issue is how far the tutor, who ought to act as a counselor, should aid in the evaluation of ideas before suggesting self-censorship. Often, Sherwood argues, tutors fail to function as counselors while simultaneously denying any one approach to literacy. Concerning this somewhat hypocritical tendency, Sherwood says that in practice, though we may tend to be less than open-minded, instead urging students to open their minds, we play the devil's advocate, challenging the points of their arguments, calling their ideas, ideals, and lines of reasoning into question. When faced with controversial ideas, the tutor tends to turn critical rather than sharing in positive and negative ideas. The goal of the counselor is to evaluate and improve, not remove an idea in its entirety. Yet the tutor-turned-critic encourages a form of censorship that denies legitimacy to ideas, though there may be validity to an idea that simply requires development. One should note, however, that there are points to encourage censorship and evaluate the effects that words may have on an audience. For Sherwood, that decision must always be situational and engaged cautiously. Much like Lockman, Sherwood feels that the tutor as counselor ought to override censorship in the majority of cases. However, such cases still provide dilemmas for the tutor and necessitate a proper understanding of one's role as counselor. Despite the common divide between orality and literacy within the academic sphere, the Writing Center tutor serves as a method of bridging orality and literacy that divides by modeling the formation of inner speech within conversation. Furthermore, the best method by which the tutor may model the formation of inner speech to the writer is via his or her role as the counselor. The tutor as counselor demonstrates reflective thinking by asking questions and encouraging the evaluation of ideas orally. Eventually, this oral reflectivity may be internalized into inner speech, whereby the writer no longer requires the writing tutor and can write within the academic sphere completely independently. Though seemingly simple, such a role also has wide applications and implications. On the one hand, in the classroom, the teacher may act as a counselor to encourage beginning writers. On the other hand, not every college student develops an inner speech at a young age, and the Writing Center tutor may also find himself torn between counseling a writer to cultivate ideas or suggesting self-censorship, suggesting that the role of tutor as counselor may not be clear in every situation. Regardless of the situation, however, each writing tutor ought to model and cultivate inner speech within other writers as they seek to understand a writer's ideas, regardless of his or her own thoughts. Conversations with each individual writer should seek to bridge the learned divide between orality and literacy, as ideas are evaluated and encouraged. Thank you.